So thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for inviting me here. Thank you for letting me share some of my thoughts. I hope that some of them are just slightly impactful on you as you go about in your day-to-day lives. I'll be talking about civility and respect, basically how we treat each other as human beings. So though it has been quite helpful for me in my legislative career, I think these are things that can be acted out in your day-to-day life and will help you with your relationships with your loved ones, random strangers you meet on the street, and in your professional life. So by way of context, like was mentioned before, I spent some time in the Marine Corps, spent some time in Fallujah, Iraq, and that was kind of a foundational time for me. It showed me the best of people and the worst of people. You got to see folks doing great things and then some things you wish you didn't see. But the one thing that really kind of stuck with me was this regrettable thing that we do when we go and we fight wars, which is we dehumanize the other. It makes it easier for you to do some pretty bad things to them. You make them less than you. You make them less than human. They are the other. If anyone's watched Ken Burns' Vietnam series, one gentleman notes that he didn't feel like he actually killed any Vietnamese, but he greased a bunch of slant eyes and he waxed a bunch of fill in the blank. These actions that we take to make the enemy less than us allows you to do these things to them. So come back to the United States, fast forward a little bit, doing commercial fishing, doing construction work, got the crazy idea that I wanted to run for state representative, eventually got into that job, and the thing that really struck me the most doing this legislative work was starting to hear some of the same language I had heard in Fallujah, Iraq, play out in the state capitol building. Things like, we are going to fight for our agenda, and I understand it's just terminology that people typically use, but as a person that went and fought a war, hearing good Americans refer to other good Americans in these tones, these fighting ways, really kind of irked me. Talking about tactics, how you were going to be tactical and forcing the other into a corner to do something. I don't want to sit next to them as though the opposition party was somehow less than you and your friends. So it really struck me. It was something I reflected on a lot, and so that's a bit of the negative, right? War's negative, internal fighting's a negative. Try not to be a negative guy, right? Civility, respect, it's the whole talk here, right? So here's a brief story about a positive thing that happened, and though, I didn't change anyone's mind, I didn't cause them to have an epiphany and say, Owen, you're completely right and I'm completely wrong. It was incremental. So one of my friends, Kent Ackley, got elected to the State House as a common sense independent. One of the first times in Maine's history that a person that wasn't a Democrat, Republican, Green Independent, or Independent got elected. And it's because we have a provision in our state laws that allow for folks that don't have a party to describe themselves using 3 words. You just can't have swears, you can't use other people's parties, you can't use, I believe, the state of Maine. So it's been on the books for over 100 years, great provision. I could have described myself as a fuzzy pink elephant if I wanted to, but I just decided to opt with independent. But Kent went with common sense independent. Now that raised some hairs on some folks' necks, and they put in a bill that wanted to repeal that part of the provision. Now I could have been upset about that. The one few, we've got 3 competitive advantage things about being an independent with the parties having dozens, and you're trying to remove the fact that I want to describe myself on the ballot to the constituents in a certain way. Could have been upset about it, but instead I decided to find out the bill sponsor and found her in the hall, and we had a nice conversation, and I described kind of where I was coming from, tried to figure out where she was coming from. Turns out one of her bigger gripes was, well, if he's common sense, does that mean I'm not? I think you're reading too far into it, but that's totally okay. So we had this long conversation about it. Again, I explained where I was coming from and tried to understand better where she was coming from. And we parted ways that day, and then she found me the next day. We were back in session. She pulled me aside, and she said, Owen, I wanted to tell you that I went over my testimony. When you present a bill, you provide testimony on it in support of it. And she said, I looked over my testimony and I realized I was using some really harsh language on these unenrolled independent folks, and after spending some time with you, I just didn't feel comfortable using that same type of language. So I'm still going to present my bill, I'm still going to support my bill, but I just wanted to let you know I kind of toned it down a little bit. It was nice being able to put a face to these independents. So to close that story out, she and I are still really good friends. She presented it to my committee. We had some back and forth, basically talked about the same things we had talked out in the hall, and then we went and had lunch afterwards with my aide, not realizing who I was actually having lunch with, and wanting to say, let's review all that stuff, because next time we're really going to hammer I want you to meet my friend Beth. Oh, you're having, yes. Yeah, we'll talk in a little bit. So some of the pointers on how to be more respectful and civil in your conversations. These are pointers that have worked for me in my life. If they work for you, great. If not, figure out your situation and what you're comfortable with, and build your own, gizmo for making your way through this world. So the three things for me is, one, recognizing the difference between a civil and a violent disagreement. In Iraq, that was a violent disagreement, and it wasn't very enjoyable. And when you are faced with those things, you have to kind of react a certain way. I don't view the work that I do in the state legislature as a violent disagreement with any of my colleagues. I have disagreements with them. I have significant disagreements with them. That said, those should all be civil disagreements. So situational awareness, understanding what you're doing, who you're dealing with, and really trying to differentiate between violent and civil disagreement. Disagreements are fine. It's part of everyday life. It's how you work through those disagreements that really makes a lot of impact on the back end. Another thing that I try to do in my life, and this one's slightly more difficult, if I have the ability to say to the person that I just had the disagreement with, you know what? That was so 45 minutes ago. I'm over it. Let's figure out what our next thing is to do together. Then I'll do it. That is difficult. It depends on the disagreement. It depends on the person. It depends on a lot of different factors. If you can say that was so 45 minutes ago, do it. If you can say that was so yesterday, do it. If you can say that was so last week, do it. If it takes it longer than that, that's okay. Again, everything is situational. But that ability to say, water under the bridge, I understand. We had a little bit of a tussle here, but we've got some good work we need to take care of. I'm over it. Can we move on? Something that's really helped me in my life and the ability to work with these folks. And then the last thing that I do in these debates, in these discussions, in these disagreements, it's something that no one can take away from me. It's something that no one can take away from you either. It's how you conduct yourself. I try to have every conversation, every disagreement, every debate in such a way that when we're done, we can go and take lunch afterwards. It's enjoyable. It's nice. You can spend time with that person. You understand about them, their family, how things are going for them. Winning should not be your ultimate goal. Understanding, compromise, compassion. So the ability to conduct yourself in certain ways, I think, is hugely important. You got to figure that out for yourself. But for me, in the back of my head, if things are getting heated, as much as I may want to lash out at that person, use cuss words, tear them up one side to the other, I choose not to. Why? Because if that person ran across me and my kids at the grocery store, I don't want them beelining down the produce aisle so they can avoid me in poultry. I want to be able to sit there and say, hey, how are you? Man, that was crazy the other day. We're going to have to figure this out. So finish every conversation with the ability to go and break bread with the individual afterwards. Last quick tidbit is read your emails. And I made this thing go way longer than I thought I was going to. I didn't realize I had as much time as I had. So always read your emails and prep for a talk like this. So thank you very much.